I was thinking about it as I was doing the research for this guide, and I realized something that just felt weird. This is going to be the first guide where we cover a rock-type Pokemon. Sure, we've done ground-type Pokemon before, they're very similar, but we've covered fairy and psychic types in this series before, and there have been multiple water and grass types. I don't know, I guess it just always felt to me that rock types are just as abundant as the other elemental types, but I guess at least in the Kanto Pokedex that's turning out to not be true in the beginning. But we're going to fix that issue today. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the stone-bodied Pokemon of the Geodude line. Geodude itself is a rather small Pokemon, being only 1 foot 4 inches tall and weighing about 44 pounds. Its body plan is also very simple. Its main body is a rounded boulder, where its large mouth and wide eyes are, with 2 muscular arms coming out of either side. Its body is also made of a craggy grayish stone, although older Geodudes do tend to smooth themselves out. Overall, it's a very simple body plan. When they evolve into a Graveler, they do get a decent size bigger, now averaging around 3 foot 3 inches tall and shooting way up in height, averaging around 231 pounds. They have the same stony, boulder-like body as Geodude, though its large middle sphere is so large that it actually looks like a whole body as opposed to just a head. Graveler also now has 4 arms instead of Geodude's 2, a new set of feet, and a stony crest above its eyes. Usually in the wild, this is where the evolution line ends, but if you manage to get a Graveler through a trade with another trainer, then it'll evolve one last time into a Golem. Golem actually takes a departure from the rest of the line in that its body doesn't look like it's made out of pure rock. Instead, it has a large round shell that covers nearly its entire body, with only its legs, arms, and face sticking out. The shell looks almost like stone blocks that have been slotted together to make it. Its legs and arms are very short and stubby, with sharp claws on the end of the toes and fingers, and the face is almost reptilian in nature, sticking out of the middle of the front of the shell. Accompanying this change in body plan is a massive increase in size, now standing 4 foot 7 inches tall and weighing a whopping 661 pounds, making Golem the heaviest Pokemon that we've talked about in this series so far. In all, these Pokemon hold new challenges that we haven't seen yet in this series, so let's get into it and find out if these big rocky boys are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. A lot of people like to diss on rock-type Pokemon due to their many weaknesses, like steel, grass, and water, and for the fact that many people see rock types as just boring Pokemon. But the nice thing about that simplicity is that it often means that they have easy enclosures to raise them in, like with the Geodude line. In the wild, you often find these guys on rocky trails, or on the side of mountains, or in caves. And while that is their preferred environment, it doesn't mean that you need to live on the side of a mountain for them to be comfortable or happy. Really, these Pokemon could live anywhere as long as their environment contains a few specific elements. One of which being a home where they can escape the elements. After all, being weak to water type attacks, they really aren't a fan of rain or snow, so they need a place that they can go to that they don't have to worry about any storms that are coming through. But, contrary to what anyone who listens to this series might expect, I'm not going to recommend repurposing a shed to make their home. Mostly because these Pokemon do very well when they have a solid connection to the ground. Both Geodude and Graveler like to bury themselves in the ground somewhat when they sleep, and when Golem sheds its shell, the old shell will then crumble and turn to dirt. If you provide them with a shed, then the floor of the shed will just be getting in the way. Plus, the fact that I usually mention the shed as a way to protect your Pokemon from the temperatures outside, as you can regulate how cold or hot it gets inside of the shed using different methods. But, being mainly rock types and living on the slopes of mountains, these Pokemon handle both the cold and the heat much better than most other Pokemon. So instead of the shed, I would recommend that you provide them with a sort of awning or pagoda, something that'll keep a certain spot of the enclosure dry, but is still sturdy enough that the Pokemon could bump into it and it won't be too affected by it. After all, Graveler and Golem prefer to roll everywhere, and they aren't the most graceful Pokemon when they do that. Just be sure to get something that'll cover an area of space large enough for your Pokemon to still move around a bit. So, at least 15 feet by 15 feet. If you really wanted to, you could even hang some mesh curtains along the sides to help prevent the weather from making it under the awning, but do keep in mind that isn't necessary and it may get in your Pokemon's way. As for the rest of the enclosure, it really doesn't have to be anything special. A simple grass yard would do fine for these guys, just so long as you keep the vegetation low. This line tends to be found along mountain trails and in cave systems, so they don't like to have tall grass or too many trees in their home. But so long as you keep your grass cut short, your yard should do fine for these guys. As for the sizes, Geodude is going to need the least amount of space. Not only because they're the smallest of the line, but also because they're the least mobile of the trio. Geodude tend to only move when they're in search of food, and since they eat minerals and rocks, it's not that long of a hunt. When they aren't looking for food, they tend to partly bury themselves in the ground and remain perfectly still. That's why you so often hear of people that went mountain hiking and stepped on a Geodude by accident. It's because they blend in with the environment so well. For a Geodude, I would say the best size is a yard that's at least 25 by 25 feet. That way they have the room to move if they want to, and the decor won't get much in their way, which we'll get into in a moment. When it comes to Graveler and Golem, they will need much more space, thanks to the fact that they're just much more mobile than Geodude. Thanks to their relatively stubby legs compared to the rest of their body, they've developed a tendency to roll when they want to move anywhere farther than like 10 feet. So that means that they need an enclosure that is large enough for them to actually roll around. Thankfully, there isn't a massive difference in size when you compare the two of them, so Graveler and Golem can have the same size enclosure. You're going to be looking at something that's 75 feet by 75 feet, large enough that they will have plenty of room to roll without it being unmanageable. One thing that you will have to do though is that you will have to use some pretty sturdy fencing to make the walls of your enclosure. After all, if your 200-pound Graveler or your 600-pound Golem slams into it after picking up some speed while rolling, you want to make sure they don't just smash through whatever you have keeping them in. A few solutions to this are making a fence with concrete pillars that go deep into the ground so that when they hit them, they won't be ripped out of the ground. Another possible solution could also be to get massive stone blocks that can be stacked like building blocks along the edge of your property. These things are sturdy enough and heavy enough that they should be able to take a direct hit from your Pokemon, even if they built up a ton of speed. These are just a few options that you can use, and there are a bunch more out there for those of you that don't like the two options I've given. Just keep in mind, you will need something to keep your Pokemon in. Another thing that I'm going to mention here is the decorations. As I've mentioned before, these Pokemon live on the side of mountains, usually along mountain trails. So for them to be the most comfortable, you should have rocks of different sizes scattered throughout the enclosure. They can be of all different kinds of sizes, so long as they aren't so big as to take up a large part of the enclosure, and they're spread out enough to not impede your Pokemon from moving around easily. Also, you should keep an eye on these rocks, as you may have to replace them if your Pokemon gets hungry and decides to nibble on one as a snack. Yes, these Pokemon eat rocks, but we'll cover that when we get to the care section. Just know that they might occasionally take a bite out of the decorative rocks. The same actually goes for if you use the stones to make the border around your enclosure, now that I think about it. Just keep an eye on these as well if you end up going with that path. You don't want your Pokemon to eat their way out of their enclosure. The last part of the enclosure section is going to be what can be housed with them. There are a few types to avoid with these guys, those being water and grass types. Not because these guys are unfriendly, but because if these Pokemon get annoyed with your Geodude evolution, they can end up doing some serious damage to it. As well, fighting types should also be avoided. Like we mentioned in the Machop Care Guide, fighting types will often use heavy rocks to work out with, and trying to do that with your Geodude evolution will just irritate the Pokemon, which could lead to fights that probably won't end well for your rock type. Aside from that, you should also make sure that any Pokemon that you put in with a Graveler or a Golem is either fast enough to get out of their way, or sturdy enough that getting hit by them won't be a problem. After all, like I said, they aren't exactly graceful when they roll, and in the wild they'll often just bounce off rocks and trees in their environment until they come to a stop. So anything too slow or too squishy probably won't end well with these guys. Other rock types, plenty of steel types, non-aggressive fire types, normal types, possibly even the less territorial flying types would all be good choices to house with these guys. They also do very well with their own kind, often being found in groups out in the wild as opposed to solitary members. Though, do be aware that these Pokemon, especially Geodude, like to test their strength and hardiness against one another by bashing themselves together. This can lead to pieces being chipped off their bodies. We'll cover this better in the care section, but I wanted to say here that if that happens, don't be alarmed. Your Pokemon are perfectly fine. It's just something that will happen if you have multiples of this Pokemon in an enclosed space. And always remember that I only ever give you the specifications for only one Pokemon per enclosure. If you do plan on adding in more, be sure to expand the enclosure accordingly to the new Pokemon's needs. Availability. When talking about the first two evolutions, they're highly available in the wild. Geodude is so numerous wherever there are mountains and caves that there's a native population in almost every region. The only two without a native Geodude population are Galar and mainland Paldea, and even then, the Kitakami region is well known to have them. But places like Mount Moon, Coronet Mountain, Mount Silver, most Victory Roads, and all the routes surrounding these mountains are well known to have Geodude and Graveler populations. Even my home of Unova, which is notorious for trying to keep Pokemon native to other regions out of its environments, has a native population of these Pokemon in Challenger's Cave. So my point is that if you want to find these Pokemon, then you probably don't have to travel too far to find them. I should mention to those of you that live in Alola, you won't be able to find the version of Geodude that we're talking about in this guide. Instead, you'll find the Alolan version of this line, which has adapted to have the electric type. We'll talk about that specific line when we get to the Alola Pokemon in the future. Back to the Cantonian line, the only one that you won't find in the wild is Golem. Thanks to their ground type, Graveler almost never experience the needed electrical shock to stimulate their systems to evolve outside of a trading machine, leading to the near non-existence of wild Golem. Which brings us to breeders. Thanks to the prevalence of the first two evolutions, these Pokemon aren't as popular to have in the breeding industry. But thanks to the fact that they're relatively easy to raise in large numbers, and the fact that going out to catch one of the later evolutions can be somewhat risky, there are people out there that do raise them. It's not going to be like trying to find a tentacle breeder, and if you're looking for a sure way to get a Golem, then this is the best method in my opinion. So if you don't live near where these Pokemon live, and you don't want to or can't travel to go get a wild one, then you might just have to do a little bit of digging to find someone that raises these Pokemon. Catchability. Geodude is going to be the easiest to catch out of the three evolutions. After all, they do congregate along mountain trails, so all you really need to do is go hiking for a day and you should find one. I would recommend bringing a water or grass type Pokemon with you to protect you, as they can get a bit grouchy, especially if you find them by accident by stepping on them, which is often how these encounters start. The nice part is that they aren't the strongest Pokemon on the mountain, so a Pokeball should be plenty strong enough to catch them. Graveler and Golem, if you're lucky enough to find one in the wild, are very similar when it comes to catching them. Hunting them down will be riskier than with Geodude, as they don't frequent the hiking trails and instead scale the mountainside itself, meaning that to find them, you'll often have to go off trail, which can be dangerous if you aren't prepared for it. So really, be sure that you are fit enough to handle going over rough, uneven terrain. You'll also need to keep your head on a swivel and listen for the sound of these Pokemon rolling down the mountainside at high speeds. These Pokemon have been clocked at speeds upwards of 60 miles per hour, and I don't have to tell you what it'll mean if a 200 or 600 pound rock hits you at that speed. Even if you manage to find one that isn't rolling, these Pokemon have a worrying tendency to explode if they feel they are in enough danger. Bring a strong water or grass type with you, with your best option being a water type with the damp ability, as that would prevent them from blowing up on you altogether. If you manage to get to the point where you can catch them, the best thing to use would be something near the strength of a Great Ball for Graveler, and absolutely bring an Ultra Ball for Golem. You will need the extra power they bring. Please, if you decide to go after one of the later evolutions, be careful. They can be very dangerous. Care. Alright, let's address the exploding thing first before we get into anything else. As I just said, the later evolutions have a tendency to use the moves Self-Destruct and Explosion if they feel threatened enough. Now, contrary to the rumor out there, these moves don't actually cause the Pokemon to blow itself to smithereens. They do, however, cause an explosion that deals just as much damage to the Pokemon that use the move as it does to whatever they use the move on. And, of course, you don't want your Pokemon to do that, meaning you need to make sure that the Pokemon feels safe around you and in its enclosure. To that end, you should spend some time every day building your trust with the Pokemon. This will be easier with a breeder-raised Pokemon as opposed to a wild-caught one, but since we're working with the later evolutions, they're thankfully much less competitive than Geodude. So, to build trust with this Pokemon, there are a few things that you can do. One is, of course, feeding them. These Pokemon feed on different minerals that are often found in the rocks of the mountain ranges that they live in. This can range from the common quartz crystal to small deposits of salt to the more rare ones such as malachite. They use these minerals to not only fuel their stone bodies, but also heal and regrow the parts that end up breaking off. Meaning, yes, you will be feeding these Pokemon rocks. That's why I mentioned earlier that they may start to nibble on the stones that you place throughout their enclosure. But you can't just feed them any rocks you find lying on the side of the road. One, the chemicals and oils that are found on blacktop isn't good for them. And two, they need a very specific mixture of minerals to allow them to function and remain healthy. Missing any of them could mean that your Pokemon starts to have health problems. Thankfully, there are plenty of diets that have been developed designed to accommodate many different species of rock-eating Pokemon. The majority of the Geodude line's diet, around 60% or so, is going to consist of silica, which is the main component in the majority of rocks that you'll find, but differs based on what kind of rock you use. Then the remaining should be 25% quartz, 10% salt, and the remaining 5% should be made of a mixture of other common minerals. You can also mix in rarer minerals if you like, but treat them more as treats as opposed to common food. Too much of them could lead to health problems for your Pokemon. As for how often to feed them, these Pokemon are more grazers than anything, feeding on small amounts as they go throughout their day. So, the best bet is to leave them out for them to munch on as they go through their day. Just spread them throughout the enclosure and your Pokemon should munch on them when they want to. I mean, they're rocks, so it's not like they're going to be going bad, so there's no harm in putting them out early in the morning and just leaving them there all day. Amount-wise, you're looking at a consistently escalating amount of stone that you're going to be needing. A good rule of thumb that I've seen online for these guys is that they should eat an average of 5% of their body weight a day, meaning Geodude will need around 2 pounds of food, Graveler will need about 11 or 12 pounds of food, and Golem will require a massive 33 pounds a day of food. Even if the food is just rocks, that can be a massive amount of food to sustain. Back to the original point, through you providing this food every day, they will slowly start to associate you with that positive stimuli, leading to them becoming much more relaxed and comfortable around you. The second way to make sure your Pokemon is more comfortable around you is through washing and cleaning them. When they roll around, or through Geodude burying itself when it sleeps, your Pokemon will inevitably become dirty. This dirt can wedge itself into the cracks and nooks of the Pokemon's stone body, and while it won't affect their health too much, after all they are ground types, it can affect their movement, their senses, and even cause chafing if it's in the wrong spot. To that end, every few weeks or so, you will have to clean them and get the dirt out of the nooks and crannies on their body. Now, with the reversion to water, you aren't just going to hose them down. Instead, you're going to need to get a long-handled, thin brush that's designed for this kind of thing. Or a toothbrush if you're in a pinch. Wet the brush slightly, not to the point where it's soaked, but just enough to activate the soap that you're going to put on the brush next. Be sure to get a soap that's non-corrosive and Pokemon friendly. And then you're going to take the brush and slowly use it to scrub, scrape, and brush the dirt off its body. The soap should suds up slightly as you're working, helping to dissolve the more stubborn stuff that gets stuck in there. Then, after you get the dirt out of wherever it was, take a dry, clean cloth and wipe the soap suds off your Pokemon. Don't use water to get it off. Your Pokemon will hate it and will make this harder to do in the future. So long as you use only a little bit of water and reward your Pokemon for going along with the behavior, this should prove to be another way for you to bond with and build trust between you and your Pokemon. Plus, as a nice bonus, it will help keep your Pokemon healthier over the long run. The last thing that I want to talk about is your Pokemon's body. More specifically, the tendency for the Pokemon of this line to leave body parts laying behind. Now, that sounds worse than it is, but it's still something that can freak people out if you have one of these Pokemon and it happens unexpectedly. This is most pronounced with Graveler. Thanks to its tendency to roll everywhere at high speeds and the lack of Golem's protective shell, when Graveler slams into a hard object, it can sometimes break off bits of its body. This can be as minor as some stone chipping off the body somewhere, to something as major as losing an arm. Luckily, Graveler also has the ability to regenerate any body parts that it loses, so even if it does lose an arm, it will eventually be able to grow it back with plenty of supervision and plenty of food. Geodude also does this, but to them it's more of a territorial show of strength kind of thing. So if you're keeping multiple Geodude together, or even keeping other rock-type Pokemon with them like Carbink or Rock'n'Rolla, they will slap themselves off each other, trying to see who's stronger. This can lead to chips being taken off of your Geodude, and if they consistently lose the contest of strength, it can lead to your Pokemon becoming slightly smaller and more spherical over time. This isn't a terrible thing, as the more that gets chipped off, the more tempered their attitude gets, but do keep an eye out, as Geodude does not regenerate like Graveler does. Golem is the one that you really have to worry about the least. As they age and grow, they will shed their shells while growing a new one. This is the one you have to worry about the least because they'll have grown a new shell underneath the old one by the time they shed it. In fact, you don't even have to get rid of the old shell, as it'll quickly crumble into a dirt pile that you'll just have to kick around to flatten out. The only thing to keep an eye on is that once your Golem reaches a certain age where they stop growing, they will stop shedding their shell. So don't freak out if suddenly your Golem hasn't shed in a while. Also, the dirt that comes from the old shell is great for plant growth. So if you can find a farmer, you might be able to sell it to them. Or you could use it to grow your lawn. Up to you. Cost. The Enclosure will be in the high category, so long as you already have the space for it. Really, where most of the cost is going to be coming from here is the walls. No matter what kind of barrier you decide to go with, it'll probably cost you a decent penny to get it. Aside from that, the gazebo awning thing and the decoration rocks will add on a little bit of cost, but not much. As for the Pokemon, the price can vary. The price will change based on which one you're going after. Geodude should be in the very low or the low category, mostly because you'll probably go out and catch it yourself, meaning it's really a matter of how many Pokeballs you use on it. Graveler and Golem, though, I would say that it would be better and safer for you to get one from a breeder, mainly to get a head start on the not exploding thing. Graveler, thankfully, will be in the moderate category, but Golem will probably jump you up into the low end of the high category. The food won't be more than the moderate category. Sure, it's going to be a lot for the later evolutions, but come on, it's rocks. If you go to a quarry and explain to them what you're looking for, then they should be able to give you enough to feed your Pokemon for a while. And always remember that buying in bulk or large amounts can often save you money in the long run. Conclusion. I really wasn't expecting a lot from these Pokemon. Like I said, they're so common near mountains and caves that you really don't think of them that much. Mostly they're just something to keep an eye out for as you walk mountain trails. But as I did this research, I really grew to like these guys. I mean, they're great beginner Pokemon. Sturdy, simple, and I mean, they eat rocks, so you don't have to deal with raw meat or live prey. The only issue that I can see with them is the exploding thing. But they're often so laid back that unless you're actively attacking them, it's not that big a danger. It's still something to look out for, and the latter two evolutions are rather big for younger owners, but if you're looking for a Pokemon line that's sturdy and easy to care for, then these could easily be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the fiery equine Pokemon Ponyta and Rapidash. Have a wonderful night, everyone.